Hey everyone, Tera Roberts here with FantasyPros, bringing you another round of 10 players to cut. Before we get started, be sure to like this video and subscribe to FantasyPros across all platforms. Now let's go ahead and dive right in with players to cut in 12 and 14 team leagues. First up, Brandon Bolden. Because Brandon Bolden played on Thursday night, you'll have to wait to cut him, but put a giant flag on him because you need to drop him as soon as you can. Last week looked like a good opportunity for Brandon Bolden to have an uptick in touches. Damian Harris was out with a concussion, and Ramondre Stevenson had been in and out of favor with Bill Belichick all year. It seemed like Brandon Bolden would have the opportunity to get more passing work and possibly some more rushing attempts with Stevenson as the lead back. But that didn't happen, and Stevenson put on a show, leading the backfield with 20 rushing attempts for 100 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. JJ Taylor added in 6 carries, and Brandon Bolden had 3 carries, which was the same amount as Kendrick Bourne, the wide receiver. Brandon Bolden did not have a big role in the passing game either. Stevenson led all backs with 5 targets, and Brandon Bolden only had 3 targets. And this week against Atlanta, with both Harris and Stevenson playing, Bolden had 1 carry for 1 yard and 2 receptions for 15 yards. Harris had 10 carries for 56 yards and 1 reception, while Stevenson had 12 carries for 69 yards and 1 reception. This backfield is officially a full-blown timeshare, and Brandon Bolden has a very limited portion of that timeshare. And given the prior week, even when one of those running backs is out, he still won't get significant work. It seems like Bolden's role is defined as pass blocking and catching a few passes here and there per game. He may see 1 or 2 rushing attempts with his work in the passing game as well. However, it just doesn't seem like there's a consistent and predictable path to meaningful touches for him, which makes him almost impossible to rely on as a fantasy option. We need to let Bolden go. Next up, Baker Mayfield. Baker Mayfield may have a favorable matchup against Detroit, but don't let that matchup fool you into thinking there is long-term value here. He's not even the best streaming option this week if you need a fill-in. Let's break down the numbers to understand why Baker is a cut candidate. Quarterback scoring in fantasy football is as good as it has ever been. There are 18 quarterbacks right now that have tallied 150 fantasy points at least. In addition to that, Daniel Jones is almost there, and he has 148.8 fantasy points. He's in the mix with some players that have scored more because Jones had his bye week and he also had 1 less game due to injury. Mac Jones is starting to play better, and he sits at 144.2 fantasy points prior to this Thursday's game. Then there are guys like Russell Wilson and Tua Tagovailoa that would be at that 150-point mark as well if they had played all of their games. Jimmy Garoppolo is also averaging 16.23 points per game. He's not at 150 points because he missed a game and he's also had his bye week. What that means is that there are 23 quarterbacks that you can count on to score 15 or more fantasy points every single week, which makes them all players that should be rostered for either weekly starts or streaming options. Now, that may not come to fruition if they have a bad game or a tough matchup, but they are averaging that production for the season. The point is, there are way too many options to be rostering Baker Mayfield. Baker is just not right this year. He keeps suffering more injuries between his left shoulder and his foot and his knee. He also plays on a team that is 8th in the league in rushing attempts and 30th in pass attempts. That has all played a role in him averaging 14.8 fantasy points per game, and there does not appear to be much upside here. I would stream several other quarterbacks rather than play him at this point. Next up, Russell Gage. It feels weird to abandon ship on the technical lead receiver in this offense, but I think we all know that Gage just doesn't fit that role at this point. Russell Gage was targeted 3 times in the Falcons' 43-3 loss to the Dallas Cowboys. Unfortunately, he dropped 2 of those passes, marking the 2nd time he was held without a catch this year. It's hard to trust a player that doesn't even catch a pass in a 40-point loss. Against the Patriots on Thursday, Gage had 5 catches for 49 yards. It's becoming very apparent that Gage's ceiling is barely being able to hit double-digit fantasy points in PPR, and his best game of the year was 4 receptions for 67 yards and 1 touchdown. That's not much upside when you consider the fact that his floor is literally 0. It's time to let him go. He's a guy that can flow off and on your roster if you're desperate. Next up, Ricky Seals-Jones. Seals-Jones has cooled down a little bit with just 8 targets, 5 receptions, 42 yards receiving, and no touchdowns in his last 2 games. And now he's dealing with a hip injury, and Logan Thomas is on the verge of returning. Carolina looked tough last week, and they are 13th against fantasy tight ends. Simply put, I don't think an injured player that is about to lose his starting job is worth a roster spot at this point. Next up, Rondale Moore. Rondale Moore is making a reappearance on the list this week, and it's with good reason. He continues to give us nothing. Moore has 15.9 fantasy points in his last 5 games, and for the second straight week, despite DeAndre Hopkins being inactive, he only saw 4 targets. Of course, it would help if Kyler Murray were active, but Moore hadn't exactly set the fantasy world on fire before Kyler Murray's injury. On top of that, Murray might not play this week, and they have a bye week after that, so there's not much reason to keep Moore on a fantasy roster. Better luck with him next year. Next up, Kenneth Gainwell. Let's wrap things up for 12 to 14 team leagues with another recurring player on this list, Kenneth Gainwell. In Week 10, Boston Scott led the Eagles' backfield with 11.5 fantasy points, and Jordan Howard was right behind him with 8.3 fantasy points, and the third player in the backfield was Kenneth Gainwell with a whopping 1.9 fantasy points, making him the 57th ranked fantasy running back this week. Miles Sanders is expected to return soon, which means there will be one more running back in that mix. Gainwell was a hyped rookie that was seeing playing time earlier in the year, but he has had no role since Sanders went down with an injury, and both Scott and Howard have stepped up to the plate. He's not going to have a role in this backfield moving forward, especially when Sanders is healthy. Moving on to shallow leagues, and first up is Matt Ryan. Matt Ryan has too much value in deeper leagues to let him hit the waiver wire. You would probably have to replace him with someone like Baker Mayfield or Trevor Lawrence if you cut him in deeper leagues. Ryan has had 8 fantasy points in Week 8, 29 fantasy points in Week 9, 3 fantasy points in Week 10, and against New England this week, just 4 fantasy points. He is very tough to trust right now. He is one of the lowest floors in the league, and Atlanta is quite frankly just a disaster at this point. They're depleted in talent and struggling to execute. Next week, he faces a Jacksonville team that held Josh Allen to 12 fantasy points and Carson Wentz to 7 fantasy points in their last 2 games. After that, it's Tampa Bay, who he had a decent showing against with 19 fantasy points earlier in the season, but this is a different Atlanta team. There are better streaming options out there, and it's getting to the point where it's just hard to hold on to him even in deep leagues. Next up, Jeremy McNichols. I would hesitate to cut him in a deeper league because it's only been 2 games, they've been against tough defenses, and we haven't exactly seen what his usage would be in a game where the Titans trail in the game early. Each of the last 2 weeks, the Titans have been in games where they didn't have to abandon the run. He was 3rd on the team in carries last week. Donta Foreman led the way with 11 carries, Adrian Peterson was next with 8 carries, and McNichols only had 4 carries. McNichols was also only targeted 3 times in the passing game, which produced just 1 reception for 1 yard. Fantasy managers in deeper leagues probably need to wait and see what his role looks like in a game where the Titans trail, but I would look for other options in shallow leagues before that happens. Next up, Jarvis Landry. Jarvis Landry has 10 targets, 7 receptions, and 37 yards in his last 2 games. In a 41-16 win, he had no upside. He also had no upside in a 45-7 loss, where the Browns could not move the ball in any situation. It seems like he just has no upside at all at this point. Baker Mayfield has a ton of injuries, and this team just doesn't throw the ball that much. It would be hard to cut Landry in a deeper league because a team's wide receiver 1 is usually not available on the waiver wire, but I'm okay with dropping him in shallow leagues because this passing offense is one of the worst in the league. and there's not much upside in playing Landry at this point. He just seems destined for mediocre numbers. And finally, Jared Cook. It's hard to trust a player that sees 1 reception on 3 targets for 10 yards. When the Chargers' offense is clicking, Donald Parham actually takes away some of that production, as he did in Week 9. Parham had 39 yards in that game to Cook's 28 yards. Last week, Parham had 1 reception for 17 yards, and Cook had 1 reception for 10 yards. There should just be better streaming options than Cook, who faces Pittsburgh in Week 11 and Denver in Week 12. And that wraps things up for this week's 10 players to cut. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to Fantasy Pros across all platforms so that you don't miss out on any of our great content, and come back here next week for another round of 10 players to cut.